Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Perry World House. My name is Michael Horowitz. I am the faculty director here, and I'm excited to introduce today's event, our first in-person event of the second semester, and also the first event of our 10th anniversary year here at Perry World House, which we will be celebrating throughout the year. We have a series of different things that we'll be bringing to you, all to celebrate the opening of the doors of this tremendous building and this institution back in 2016. Since 2016, Perry World House has been Penn's hub for global policy engagement. We focus on bridging the gap between academia and the policy world, and we focus our work on 4 pillars: democracy, security, climate change, and global justice and human rights. We have some incredible programming coming up today. I will let Professor Al-Hussein introduce the event in more depth, but first, let me embarrass him by introducing him. Zaid Rad Al-Hussein served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2014 to 2018. He is currently the president and CEO of the International Peace Institute and Perry World House Professor of Practice of Law and Human Rights at the University of Pennsylvania. He twice served as Jordan's ambassador to the United Nations in New York and once as Jordan's ambassador to the United States. In January 2014, he served as president of the UN Security Council, and in 2002, he was elected the first president of the governing body of the International Criminal Court, guiding the court for its first 3 years from 2002 to 2005. He holds degrees from Johns Hopkins and the University of Cambridge, and is an incredible leader that we're really honored to have with us at Perry World House. So please join me in welcoming Professor Al-Hussein to the stage.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm delighted to announce or introduce today's event, which is part of a more general initiative led by Perry World House, as we've just heard from Michael, to bring together experts from academia and the policy world to reflect on the future of global development. This conversation comes at a timely moment. We have recently witnessed the dismantling of USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, an institution that was instrumental with respect to global development initiatives, expanding healthcare, education, and economic opportunity around the world. Though imperfect, this system managed to leverage multilateral institutions and civil society organizations in an effort to alleviate suffering, reduce poverty, and save lives. Yet, even before USAID's closure, this system for development was placed increasingly under strain. Governments were realigning resources toward hard security as well as to disaster response, from pandemics to climate catastrophes. At the same time, the multilateral institutions struggled to adapt to new economic and political realities that were having a pronounced effect on development approaches, realities that could not always assure equitable partnership or long-term outcomes. As a global development is at a crossroads, we are honored to have with us today one of the world's foremost experts on the subject matter, an old friend, the Right Honorable the Lord Malloch Brown, affectionately known as Mark by everyone who worked with him at the UN. Mark has had a long career in international affairs, from development, business, and communications. At the United Nations, he led the promotion of the UN Millennium Development Goals as the head of the UN Development Program at the beginning of the millennium. At UNDP and previously as Vice President of External Affairs at the World Bank, he led reform efforts to increase the effectiveness of both organizations. In 2006, he served as Kofi Annan's Chief of Staff and then as the UN Deputy Secretary General before joining the British government of Prime Minister Gordon Brown as Minister responsible for Africa and Asia from 2007 to 2009. Most recently, he was president of the Open Society Foundations, the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. Mark is a visiting professor of practice at the London School of Economics. He was knighted for his contributions to international affairs and is currently on leave from the British House of Lords. Our moderator today is Aisha Kaya. She's a professor of political science at Swarthmore College and adjunct professor of business economics and public policy at the Wharton School. Her research centers on multilateral economic institutions, particularly the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and global environmental governance. She's currently writing a book on global climate finance, which also integrates her observations from several climate change summits, the COPs. She's a former visiting fellow at Perry World House. Please help me in welcoming them on the stage.
Welcome, everyone. Happy birthday to Perry World House. It's a huge achievement, and it's a real honor and a great pleasure to be here sharing the stage with Lord Mark Malloch Brown. Before we turn to the audience, I'd like to begin by asking you a few questions. And I'd like to begin by quoting you back to yourself, if that's okay. In your great Financial Times article from September 2024, you wrote, quote, today, as their relative influence declines in an enlarged global economy, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, are at a crossroads, unquote. Could you please elaborate on where you see this fork in the road leading? What are the key political, economic, and institutional factors that will determine the future direction of these core global economic institutions?
Esha, thank you. And it's obviously great to be here with you, and I'm thrilled to be the first event of the season. That means it can only get better from now on. So come back for the rest of their program. But let me just begin to respond to that by saying that, obviously, as a proportion of the global economy, however you measure it, these two institutions are much less dominant than they were in 1946 when they first opened their doors. And it's not just a measure of size, but also really of hard influence, in the sense that their original design had hardwired into it the idea of the gold standard, of fixed currencies, and of the strategic role of governments in determining any change in the relationship between those currencies. We've moved into an era of open markets and of global private financial flows, which not just in volume terms, but in sort of policy weight and influence terms, have completely, if you like, fragmented that original world for which these two institutions were designed. And yet, despite that, they have remained formidable sources of influence in the world economy, in many ways far outweighing their economic size, their blessing of a country's performance, whether it is the IMF through its surveillance work or the bank through who it prioritizes in terms of its lending partners, can, bring private flows to bear into a country or stop those private flows if they intimate that they don't think a country's performance is all it should be. So they are still, if you like, organizations of influence, even if their relative financial power has lessened. And, in a strange way, the work that I've been doing on the World Bank and IMF, which was done on behalf of the presidents or chief executives of the two institutions, you know, we were asked, I and two other authors were asked to look at what happens to the next 20 years of these institutions. What issues do they need to sort of front up to deal with? And, you know, in some ways, the year in which we were writing this report and consulting around the world on it, there was almost as much change as in many decades that had preceded it. We came in to take on the task during the late autumn days of Joe Biden, and the world seemed a slightly sleepy place, like the American president of the day. And then, you know, all hell was let loose when Donald Trump arrived as president. And, you know, the institutions have now got to deal with a very different environment, a relatively benign presidency, which was very conscious that it was the leading global power and, you know, often behaved pretty badly to friends and allies, has been replaced by a government which is much more hostile to friends and allies, and indeed seems to be seeking out new partners out of former enemies. So, you know, both in finance and politics and security, you know, we're entering into a world which is in some ways been turned upside down. So when I wrote those words in the Financial Times, which was in September of 24, I probably had more prophetic quality than I anticipated, because, you know, frankly, these institutions are fighting for relevance again in a very new context.
I want to pick up on your notion of fragmentation, which you mentioned with reference to private financial flows. But if we look at fragmentation in the global aid system, it predates the current shakeup in the U.S. foreign assistance giving, though it's certainly being compounded by it, as you just highlighted. China has emerged as an important, if contested, actor in both bilateral development assistance as well as multilateral institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, while geopolitics, as we know, has become increasingly central. So given this landscape, what is your vision for how global development assistance should be governed going forward? What principles and institutional arrangements matter most if we are to achieve both legitimacy and effectiveness?
Well, the AIIB, the Asian, the new Chinese Asian Development Bank, like so many other banks, is quite closely modeled on the World Bank. Its first president had in fact served at the World Bank. Its new president, she's just taking office, you know, is herself had worked at the World Bank in the Chinese Executive Director's Office. So there is a heavy degree of modeling on the World Bank. And I think, you know, in general, Chinese development efforts, whether it is through the AIIB or their own bilateral programs, have, you know, been much more respectful of Western development experience than many in the West allow. And, you know, so just to make a few points about the model, one on the, about the arrival of new donors like China, and perhaps concentrating particularly on China itself. You know, first, you know, obviously in a region like Africa, China is now the major donor, and that precedes the shuttering of USAID. That was already the case. And, you know, when you add to that other smaller but very active donors like the Gulf countries, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the dominant role of Turkey, which has today a bigger diplomatic presence in Africa than, say, the UK does. And, you know, I, who often have to fly out of Africa to different places, the hardest flights to get on are the flights from West Africa to Istanbul and Ankara, because there is just so many Turkish businessmen and officials, traveling that route nowadays. You've got smaller programs, but significant ones by India and Brazil in developing country regions as well. So the old sort of Western hegemony of development finance has long since broken and been replaced by, a healthily more competitive multi-country system. If and that I think is key. You then look at the world of sort of multilateral development finance, and here too you find much greater diversity. For many years now, there have been regional development banks, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. But there are also a group of other institutions, some national, some sub-regional, which have grown up and proliferated, so that if you put the whole system of national development financial institutions plus regional and sub-regional ones together, and the World Bank as a sort of flagship to the whole, and you have a extraordinary sprawling system of multilateral development bank financing. And sometimes I think we make a mistake to just single out the World Bank and not look at the system as a whole. And there's now been a lot of work done under the leadership of a French official to try and make us think of this category of institutions as one, and to work out how to strengthen it as a whole. Because you look, for example, at the development bank in Brazil, and it is bigger than many international development banks. It's a very large institution indeed, and you look at the tasks it's undertaking of, trying to slow the rate of tree loss in the Amazon, or to work on alternative livelihoods in the Amazon, and it's every bit as important a development mandate as things being done by the World Bank, or in that case, the Latin American Development Bank, etc. So, there's a whole system out there, and yet in many ways, we still look at this through the lens of 20 or 30 years ago, where the World Bank dominates on the multilateral side, and the United States and its Western allies dominate on the bilateral side. That's no longer the picture. And even going beyond the multilateral piece, today, most developing countries have pretty healthy domestic revenue raising as well. They have a series of private sector partners, both lenders and investors. So the whole scene, the geography of international development, or of development finance, has become incredibly more complex and varied and extensive than it was in the past. And I think the last bit to catch up is both our perception of it, and also, if you like, the intellectual and policy basis of it, because that has remained very dominated through the World Bank's big intellectual impact. Has remained heavily dependent on a sort of economic set of ideas generated largely out of institutions like this and other Ivy League schools in the US and a handful of schools in Europe. And yet, in the same way that there is now a diversity of development partners, in truth, if you look at development at the country level, there is now a diversity of intellectual and policy approaches as well. There is much greater heterodoxy, if I can put it like that, about the way to successful development than was the case, say, 20 years ago.
It's fascinating, and also it's very paradigm challenging, because as you say, maybe especially academia and some policy circles are behind. We still think of Bretton Woods institutions as central, and we start from there and call it fragmentation. And I think I really like that you challenge that notion of fragmentation, and you emphasized a lot of opportunities that can come from the diversity. Again, erase the word fragmentation, let's use the diversity. Do you also see risks in this more complex, more heterodox, more this more complex system of development assistance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, is it going to be a collaborative system or a competitive one? And, it'll have elements of both. And there's kind of good competition and bad competition. There's the competition of rival ideas, creating, challenging debates about choices people have in development. And that can be constructive and helpful. And, I uh, ran UNDP and before that had a senior position at the World Bank and found that I'd completely changed sides when I moved between the two institutions in that the World Bank, at the time had a very sort of austere economic view of development, whereas UNDP prided itself on its focus on people and what it called human development. And for me, I quickly saw the value in both approaches, but loved the idea that countries could make their own choices and hear the debate between the two. And so there was a healthy dimension to the competition, but it would often degenerate into a very unhealthy effort to, grab the ear of the finance minister in a country and ban the other institution from his or her presence. And, I can see the same dynamics at work today between the development banks. Just to give you an example, going back to the AIIB, um, there's a lot of ODI, a think tank in London, does a regular assessment through talking to different stakeholders of the performance of the different MDBs and sort of ranks them on this. And, one of the strengths of the AIIB has been that it's a great co-funder. You go to it with an idea that you've already got funding for, it would write you a check to add to that co-funding. And it quickly got a reputation as the least bureaucratic, most responsive, fastest moving development bank. And I was telling the new head of the AIB about this research and, how proud she should be of it. But she said, oh, but actually that's going to stop because the reason we were such good co-financiers was we had no staff. So we couldn't develop our own loans. So of course we co-financed other people's, but now we're going to develop a full staff and have our own education department and our own infrastructure department and the rest. So now we'll originate loans and look to others to co-finance with us. And at one level, that's a healthy evolution and development, but with it comes a lot of risk because, what you find as a borrower at the moment is that each of these institutions wants its own paperwork. None of them will accept each other's paperwork. And, this is, and it's not like, maybe it is like getting a house loan, but it's not really. It's, it's reams of paperwork to be filled in, different diligences, different environmental assessments to be commissioned, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the reasons for the fragmentation is a lot of very proud institutions who think there's only one way to do things, and that's their way. Now, fortunately, there is a new generation of leadership coming into these institutions, and Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank, who comes from having run MasterCard, is impatient with all this kind of bureaucracy, and so is trying to strip it away and say, one bank's diligence should be good enough for all the other banks, and to sort of try and get it down to one set of documents agreed with the lead lender, and then the co-financiers come in. But what we've gone through is a period where the vested interests of the staffs of these institutions have added huge amounts of complexity to the borrower. And going forward, those are the kind of things which have got to be sort of stopped if we're to get the real advantage of a networked, multi-institution development financing system.
I want to go back to you heading one of the most important institutions within the United Nations system, the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, and shift our attention to the UN a bit. In 2024, UN advanced an ambitious reform agenda through the Pact for the Future. It's trying to reinvigorate multilateral cooperation and adapt it to contemporary global challenges. Yet there are profound questions about whether the UN can realistically play this modernizing and unifying role. And I think there's no better person than you, perhaps, to illuminate that question. Where do you see this potential for renewal for the UN's role, and where are the constraints likely to be binding?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I think that the UN's efforts to sort of face up to the future through the UN at 80 report, frankly, are disappointing. The changes proposed are probably not radical enough. But the difficulty is, it's sort of been making these plans with a loaded gun pointed at it, which is never the best circumstance under which to make any changes in any organization. There's a sort of coercive threat from the US, particularly that, if you don't, cut back, reduce what you're doing, in a really strong way, we're not going to fund. And, that sort of blunt threat, of course, has put the backs up of a lot of governments and staff and everybody else who feels that the reform is not motivated by how could the UN do better, but is motivated instead by, the biggest donor, threatening to hold back their money. And, you can't actually there's no worse way to introduce reform than that kind of meta threat hanging over the institution. And so I think, in many ways, it will fall to the next Secretary General, who expected to be elected in the latter part of this year, that she or he, will find themselves inheriting an organization which, is under-resourced, is struggling to keep its head above water financially, and which still has, too many mandates, too many demands from member states of what it should do, and is spread too thin. Now, having said that, there are, some interesting signs of, both risk and reform. On the reform side, we have at least one person in the audience who knows more about this than me, but, the US has typically been the most generous funder of the humanitarian side of the UN, and big funders of all the individual agencies, the World Food Programme, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, et cetera, UNICEF. This time, it's given a single grant to OCHA, the coordinating office, with an expectation that OCHA will make the allocation between agencies. Now, on the face of it, that is a potentially system-changing reform, because there's been massive duplication between these different agencies. I was in Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh in December, and it was extraordinary, the way that the camp's management was divvied up between different agencies, and the extraordinary transaction costs of these agencies, coordinating across sectors, and the lack of accountability of anybody in the camp for the overall well-being of the refugees in the camp. So, there's clearly a lot that could be done through a single coherent funding source. So, there are a few signs that maybe there'll be some welcome change on that side. the threat is a very recent one in its latest manifestation, which is that the Board of Peace that President Trump de declared he was creating to oversee the reconstruction process in Gaza has suddenly, in its been announced over the weekend as actually a board of peace for any conflict around the world. It is a direct threat to the UN Security Council. You know, it has extraordinary features in it, including that President Trump would retain the role as its chair for life unless he chose to resign, and that he will choose its members, and that each member, if they had to have more than a 3-year term of office, have to put up $1 billion in cash to be controlled by President Trump during its first year. So the international lawyers and diplomats are going to have a field day, you know, sort of managing down this first draft charter. But you know, the fact is that in any form, it seems to be an attempt to create a new replacement organization to the security side of the UN. And so in that sense, the UN seems at risk. And, you know, today the latest twist to this tale is that, you know, this board, together with Trump's threats to Greenland, and the continued challenges of Ukraine, have led to the expectation that the meeting at Davos this week will turn into an informal sort of global security summit of some kind to deal with these issues, and in an absolutely indicative of signal of the times, the UN Secretary General has announced he's got a cold, so can't go. Well, in some ways, the UN's had a cold for a decade, and you know, is really missing in action in all of this in, you know, a way which is, I think, devastatingly disappointing for all of us who believe deeply in the organization, and you know, I think is, you know, going to be a real challenge for its new leadership as it comes in. How to revive the stature, legitimacy, and above all, the effectiveness of the organization.
In the US, as I hear from you. Well, our questions have been really easy, all about re-engineering the global financial architecture and the global political architecture. So one last question from me before we turn to the audience. Debt distress in the developing world has been an ongoing issue. And your experience is exceptionally rich in that realm as well. What do you see as the most urgent and realistic steps that one could take by borrowers, creditors, international institutions to address this debt distress in the developing world?
I mean, it is a huge problem, and you know, debt distress is only taken seriously by the traditional financial powers when it's one of them at risk, when it becomes a systemic threat to the world economy. The financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10 was taken hugely seriously. I was a national minister at the time, was sent around the world to drum up funds to sort of stabilize the global financial markets, and everybody came forward with very large checks, and we were able to stop the financial contagion. But when it is a number of, in their own terms, small African economies that are in debt risk, the world barely notices. And yet for the individuals affected, if anything, the conditions caused by debt distress are even more extreme. There are dozens of countries spending more on debt relief than they are able to spend on health or education for their citizens. And, in Africa at the moment, we have 18 countries in extreme debt distress, you know, to a level where it is really keeping a complete tight cap on the prospects of those economies growing in any serious way in the coming years. And yet they are subjected to, by the IMF and others, repeat programs of, austerity to try and squeeze out any potential overspending by government or inflationary effects, but in ways that absolutely caps the prospect of growing out of the debt crisis. And where there is a major effort to restructure debt, where countries have just said no more, we can't pay, they get hit by the ratings agencies in a way which deters critical future private investment. And the actual process of debt restructuring in Ghana and Zambia, which have been the two most recent exercises, has been so problematic and has taken so long that other countries which could do with a debt restructuring, like Kenya and Nigeria, have done everything they can to avoid it because they don't want the IMF in a way which will, not just deter foreign investors, but, almost certainly get their populations out on the street in a way which may turn out to be regime threatening. So it's a big, big problem, much bigger than you would think from any sort of survey of the international media. But it's not one with an easy and obvious answer because, as Zaid said in his introduction, this is a time where the old ODA is collapsing. We're replacing a world of grant finance by a world of loans and investment for many countries, not for the poorest who still will receive grants, I hope, but, for anything above the poorest, and when your development is funded through loans and investment, you actually can't afford reckless debt write-offs because it will deter future investment. So you've got to find a formula where the investor or lender feels a sufficient degree of protection that they will continue to lend and invest in you, but where when there is a crisis and the debt becomes unsustainable, there is a quick effort to address that, to spread out the debt repayment period, to, forgive at least the public capital part of the debt stock, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the sort of political will to come up with, a decent, quick debt resolution mechanism is really not there. The old mechanisms like the Paris Club were much too centered on Western creditors alone. The new efforts where the IMF has led in partnership with China and India to create a new debt forum, which is more representative, is at the moment still really just a talking shop and doesn't have implementation force. So you have huge disputes between America and China about which categories of Chinese debt, of which there is now a lot, given its role as the major lender to Africa, which portions of those debt should be counted as private sector debt and which are public sector debt, and therefore what treatment should both portions be subjected to. And, issues like this are left dangling unresolved, leaving a Zambia or a Ghana, much too long without a debt package, much too long without being able to fund its schools, its healthcare, etc. So, there are solutions, and they're balanced solutions, which don't mean that either the creditors take the whole price of a debt crisis, or on the other hand, that the developing country borrower takes the whole hit, where the haircut, if you like, to use the phrase, is evenly distributed between the two sides. But to get to that kind of place, you need much more political will and determination to resolve it than you've had. And just, one very final point. I mean, the other sort of I don't know whether they're bad actors in this, but disruptive actors in this are the credit agencies who struggle to understand um, the real nature of risk and debt and what is sustainable and what isn't. Because, don't ever forget that African countries get marked down as being in an unsustainable level of debt at a ratio of debt to GDP way off what a number of European and G7 countries live with as a regular condition. So there's got to be greater transparency and even-handedness around this. And at the moment, the African side is so irritated by this that they're threatening their own credit agency. But I don't think that's the solution, because people would say, well, that's the African credit agency. So, it's not objective. And so somehow we've got to sort of educate the existing credit agencies in ways that make them better judges of level and quality of debt in developing countries, because at the moment they are another source of confusion around this issue.
Incredibly rich and analysis on the debt distress. I want to turn to the audience for now. I have 10 other questions, and what we're going to do is take questions of 3. If you can please keep your questions clear and short, we would be grateful. I'll start with you, and then we'll move to the gentleman over there. There are mics going around, so we can.
Hello, thank you for your thoughts. My name is Nene. I'm a second-year master's student. So my question is concerning the future of global development, particularly about the pullout of USAID. I was in Malawi late last year, and my host was pointing out to me a lot of abandoned projects in Malawi. So I know that there'll be other countries with similar experience. So I was wondering, you've worked with a lot of these organizations. Has there never been a plan as to what happens if there's any things like there's a cut in funding, or like, has it always been that it is strictly dependent on funding coming from USAID? And the last thing is for governments of these countries that have been recipients of this funding, what has been the conversation about some of these projects that would now be in the air?
Thank you. We'll take one more or maybe 2 more questions. Thank you. And I'll go to the front row after you.
Thank you very much. So my name is Socrates Okongo. I'm from Kenya. And my question to you, Mr. Brown, is following the Paris Agreement of 2015, blended finance has been a buzzword, that it should be the future of what development assistance will look like. But since then, it was met with a lot of optimism that didn't match up with the reality on the ground. So could you talk more about blended finance and the future of it in the world of development assistance?
Thank you so much. And please.
Thank you. Great honor to have you here. Thank you very much. I have a question about the rhetoric of self-interest. When I grew up, it was seen as a source of embarrassment if any development finance was tied to self-interest. Now suddenly we seem to have the opposite. All the big players, China, the United States, but also West European countries like my native Germany, it's suddenly not only okay to speak about self-interest, it becomes a requirement of any kind of lending, borrowing, donations, and so on and so on. Is that a real deep change? Or do you, with lots of consequences? Or do you think that is more like on the surface? That was always the case. It was just not mentioned the same way.
3 great questions. Look, starting on Malawi and healthcare, but speaking more widely about in a way there was no plan B, because that's what aid is. It's additional finance beyond and above what the country itself can afford to spend on something. The only reassuring news is that in many countries in Africa at this point, actually domestic resources devoted to health are a significant portion of the total health spend. In other words, these are not services solely dependent on foreign aid, ODA. But but having said that, obviously the ODA cuts are dramatic, and there are different estimates of how many lives will be lost because of them. Uh, the very well respected British-based health publisher, The Lancet, you know, estimates millions. Center for Global Development in Washington, hundreds of thousands. I don't know what the final toll will be, but a lot of people will die because of these cuts. And it is a tragedy. So it comes then to the second point as to what the conversation has been, your second one. And strangely, despite the fact that there will be this terrible, devastating death toll in the short to medium term, the reaction of ministers has not been what you might anticipate, which is just dismay. I mean, they all are very careful and properly so to say that they are appalled at the loss of life of their citizens that will follow this. But they then go on to say, but the system was broken. It was going to end one day anyway, because it was so projectized. It was so unreliable. And, if you take those clinics and those projects that you saw in Malawi, the difficulty was they weren't part of a total funding of a Malawi health system. They were around individual diseases, a lot of it around HIV, TB and malaria from the Global Fund, HIV for the PEPFAR fund through USAID. And, the healthcare system of Malawi as a whole, was not adequately funded. And, there were often breaks in funding for these projects because the US Congress decided it wanted to put more money into Asia and less money into Africa, or more money into education than into health. And so it was a very unreliable system and not user friendly. It was very much donor friendly in its design and operation. So while people are appalled at the cuts, they also feel it is sort of cutting the coattails of a system that was no longer delivering, and that it's forcing people to both improve their domestic resource raising for this, to seek new sources of finance, either new donors or new lenders. And so there is a sense that it's the closing of a chapter, that it's been closed in a blunt and brutal way, but that it was time to move on. On the blended finance point, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a dismal record. The World Bank, for every dollar of lending, has been getting just cents on that dollar in terms of leveraged additional private finance. And, I think a principal reason for that, is that it's remained very project-based. Each individual project, the IFC, the private sector arm of the bank, will, reach out or be reached out to by private investors. And, there is an exhaustive process which the impatience of the private investors runs out, because the IFC's diligence process takes much longer than they're used to. There are just built-in inefficiencies into the system. And so in this report work I've done for the World Bank and IMF, but in this case for the World Bank bit of it, we've very much promoted the idea that instead the best way to really leverage in private money is for the World Bank to originate loans and investments, and having made them, then sell them on to private investors, in the same way that if you take a house mortgage, the mortgages get bundled by the mortgage provider and then sold on to, private investors, and that the same thing should happen with loans. Now, this requires the World Bank to standardize loans so that its health loans have the same start, or a bunch of health loans have the same start and finish date, the same conditions and terms, even though they're in different countries, so that you can make a bundle. Because, if a mortgage seller is going to sell mortgages, they've got to be mortgages of a kind, so that the buyer knows that they're getting a basket of apples, not apples, oranges, and pears. So unless you can get that kind of standardization, it won't work. So we've looked at issues like that. We've also looked at guarantees where, actually there is a very rapid increase of the amount of political risk insurance that the bank is providing through a window called MEGA. And that is, that de-risks the political risks. And one of the ironies of this is there's actually a lot more risk, for example, investing in British North Sea oil than there is in almost any project in Africa, because the British government keeps on changing the conditions around its oil licenses in the North Sea, whereas African countries are much more consistent about sustaining the political conditions around a loan, because they know they have a reputation for a lot of political risk. It's in some ways an unfairly earned reputation, but nevertheless, if you can mitigate that and say, don't worry if there's political risk, if a country nationalizes or change the conditions under which you're operating, changes the tariffs under which they're buying power from your power plant, etc., then you're covered. And so I think there are innovative ways that can leverage in private investment in much more effective ways than the current project model of blended finance. And then to the third point about self-interest, Professor, it shows your age. You're a young man. Because, I'm old enough, on the other hand, to, have lived through eras of self-interest and altruism, each of which have a sort of about a generational cycle to them. And, when I was early in the years, I was becoming very active in development. The British had funded a dam in Malaysia called Pegau, which was completely corrupt. And this led in Britain to a dramatic revisiting of development assistance and saying we can no longer tie it to trade opportunities. It's got to be a global altruism about poverty reduction. Our money has to go to wherever we can achieve the best poverty results and not be linked in any way to British exports. And this coincided with the arrival of a Labour government in Britain, the Blair government, and and the creation of a ministry, DFID, and Claire Short as its first Secretary of State. And there was an absolute, altruism, which then sort of carried out into the donor community at large. When I was head of UNDP, I would take polling data with me to see development ministers and show them. In Germany, I remember doing this to the German minister and showing her that young Germans, probably including you at the time, whatever their political affiliations, right of center or left of center, were likely to be deeply influenced in their choice of who they voted for by that party's development policy. So, and I had seen this first at the World Bank and then at UNDP, and we had a name for it. We saw it as the post-Cold War development dividend, that as military spending and geopolitical competition came down, altruism would increase. And it became the era of vast coalitions of unlikely bedmates in favor of debt relief and development. And, we really did see, in the US, for example, we saw evangelical Christian communities outraged by debt, We saw all sorts of unlikely groups coming together into these coalitions. And I remember as a Brit, you know, I had an uncle who really didn't follow what I did very much. But he was a church warden in the local church. And I knew we were winning when one day he says to me when I'm visiting from the US, tell me about this third world debt thing. And sure enough, he'd heard about it from the pulpit of his church. So there was, a universal altruism at that time. And yet, when these aid cuts came, and they're not just the US, the UK has brought its aid down from 0.7 of GDP to 0.3. The first cut was under the Tory government, and then the second cut under this current Labour government. And there was barely a whisper of public opposition to it. In fact, the cuts were popular. So what had happened in between? One, obviously, the dramatic rise of geopolitical competition again. But then, secondly, a domestic change in all our countries towards a sense that, the great post-war prosperity boom had been broken, that the next generation was going to be worse off than its parents, that the domestic problems at home were not being addressed. And above that, a effort by right-wing constituencies in all countries to link that domestic condition to, at least in part, being a fault of giving our money, our taxpayer money abroad to undeserving international causes. So a whole narrative developed of, the poor in rich countries paying for the lifestyles of the rich in poor countries. And it has devastated that development coalition. And hence, in a geopolitical era like today's, the falling back on arguments of national self-interest. We're back to the era of the Pergau Dam, and
Hopefully the next cycle will kick in soon, then we'll be back to altruism. I think we have time for one more question. Is there one more quick question? Please, Ambassador. Yes, Ambassador in the front.
It's less of a question and more of a comment, because I couldn't sit here and let the answer given to the UN crisis be left in such an pessimistic. So let me add some optimism to that. I fully agree with you about the crisis that we face as a United Nations. And from the institutional side, I agree entirely with you. I also agree that the incoming leadership will have some significant challenges and will need to have going in a mindset of reform. But I want to add that the member states are not simply sitting back and watching an organization that at least 192 of us feel is absolutely essential to remain at the center of a multilateral system. And so we have taken on the responsibility of reform ourselves. I have the good fortune of leading part of that reform effort, the Mandate Implementation Review. We've established a working group to do that, and we're well advanced and intend to adopt a General Assembly resolution that will set out concrete steps and principles and actions to guide that reform of how we task the organization to do its work. That will give significant new direction to the organization, will help to make it more efficient, more accountable, more transparent, and more impactful. And in that way, we hope to regain its trust and relevance.
Well, look, let me, if I may, Ambassador, just say that the future of the UN is in the hands of people like you. ambassadors of smaller countries who therefore have a larger sense of the importance and vitality of preserving an effective United Nations. And, you know, you are the hope, because if countries like Jamaica and so many others don't combine to say, we're simply not going to accept this new sort of bipolar world we're being offered, where we either have to sign up to one side or join a strange group of bedfellows on the other who oppose America. There is a third way, and it's to restore, renew, and update a multilateral model, which means we don't have to choose sides. We don't have to fall into a column behind one global leader or another. You know, we can hope that we can live our lives as a country knowing that there is a rule of law and an international set of principles which will govern and allow us our independence and give us legal redress if a powerful neighbor challenges it. And so that renewed United Nations may be an unanticipated legacy of this terrible moment we're living through now, where, you know, we've gone back not 80 years, but 80 plus years to the era of Yalta, and where, you know, we now have to leap forward 10 years or more to a new world where we've got to hope that the reaction to what's happening now will be indeed countries like Jamaica seizing the baton and insisting whatever big powers say. And it's not just big powers, it's a Europe which is so, for example, caught up by the understandable security problem of Ukraine, a war in its own continent again, that it's entirely lost the agency to stand up for the kind of UN you believe in. So, you know, it does fall to you and many like you to save the United Nations, because those who founded it have betrayed it.
I can't think of, as I was going to say, I can't think of ending on a better note. Such a terrific talk. Thank you so much, Lord Malik Brown.